conversation. It's amazing the number we've had, and all the speakers and the stories we've heard have been absolutely fascinating. And certainly, as you can see from my view graph right up there today, we're very fortunate to have Mike Ebbing with us with a fascinating topic that all of us know very little about. But before we get going, I'd like to cover a few things with you of some of our upcoming talks and other activities that are going on. But I'd like to, first off, just step back a little bit. If you weren't able to attend our last talk by David Barrett, I'd really strongly recommend going to our YouTube website and listen to his talk. He's talking about his recent book, 140 Days to Hiroshima. And the ending of the war in the Pacific was a touch and go all the way up to the end, and much more complex than the end of World War II in Europe. And David's book is just fascinating in terms of chronicling the key decisions that were ongoing in both the Allied leadership and very much so in the Japanese leadership. And very carefully, he chronicles everything that occurred in an exceptional manner. The book I just finished reading, and I just found it fascinating and quite illuminating in terms of what actually could possibly have happened if we had to invade Japan. It's available certainly through Amazon. It's about $20. It's well worth reading, and we'll have a copy in our own library. But anyway, our next Coffee and Conversation speaker will actually be on 9/11, 11 September, and should be quite fascinating in view of what's going on in Afghanistan currently. And we've had multiple speakers who've served in Afghanistan in one capacity or another, so maybe we'll get them. But again, Chaplain Maverden will join us, who actually spent time, 40 years actually in the military, serving as both in the regular, I think it was the infantry, and eventually becoming a chaplain. Now, the thing I'd point out is the start of that talk is going to be 11 a.m. Most of our talks start at 10. And part of the reason is there are other ongoing events and activities in commemoration of 9/11 in Broomfield that day. And particularly at 9 a.m. at the Broomfield Amphitheater 9/11 Memorial, we'll have a ceremony there involving a variety of speakers, music, and other items. So, if you're available, I'd strongly encourage you to attend that. Then come over to us for Chaplain Merverden's talk. And then finally, at 12:30 that day, or sometime after the talk's done, we'll have an encore viewing of the documentary Finding Daylight. And as highlighted here, it tells the story of two families who lost loved ones in the 9/11 attacks, to include the Fonan family who resided in Colorado. So that day there'll be tremendous different activities commemorating. It also will be the start of our new Forefathers exhibit, specifically telling the story of what occurred on 9/11. So please come back and join us that day. And then the following Saturday is Broomfield Days. And of course, that's just a lot of fun. All the other outdoor activities. There's the big parade, and we'll be in the parade. We have actually a Girl Scout troop who's going to join us to help carry the banners. The American Military Living History Association will join us for the parade. We'll have a military vehicle. Most of us can recognize that as a 2.5-ton truck. And we will probably have a variety of outdoor exhibits and stuff as well, not to mention refreshments and the museum being open and our new exhibit. So please mark that down as well. And then just to finish off September, John Pedicolis, our actual board member vice president, and John's right here. John, raise your hand. Naval aviators flew all sorts of planes off carriers, and we'll talk about kind of the history of naval aviation and how we got started flying planes off of aircraft carriers or just ships, which seems quite, yeah. So anyway, please, we have many things going on at the museum, and we hope you'll join us for that.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming this morning. I've been here a couple of times and saw a couple of the coffee and conversations. So unfortunately, I was at a concert last night downtown Denver till midnight. It was an oldies concert with the Turtles, the Association, and the Cowsills. And we were all wearing masks, but I think we were all singing. So if my voice goes out, my buddy Butch here, he was at the concert with me. And I wanted to recognize Mark Warren over here. Say hello to everybody. Mark he served also in White House communications, but he was with, I think, was it Reagan? Yeah, he was after me, so I didn't know him at the time because I served under Nixon. But Mark has been with me a couple times here to view some of the things that were going on here at the museum. And hopefully Mark is going to be on the docket to give a presentation maybe later this year on his experiences in the White House under the Reagan administration. So we'll start off. This actually is me at the Nixon Library. They have a gigantic portrait at the entryway to the Nixon Library, and I tried to get the same pose as President Nixon. So I thought I would start my presentation with an audio clip. It's about 4.5 minutes, and it's phone calls from 50 years ago, me and President Nixon while I served at Camp David as a switchboard operator. So I handled maybe 200 presidential phone calls in the 2.5 years I was at Camp David. And because of the secret White House tapes, which I knew nothing about until after I got out of the Army in 1972, all of those recordings were recorded. So my voice is on a lot of those tapes. So these clips that you're going to hear, you'll actually hear my voice, you'll hear President Nixon's voice, and remarkably, the audio from 50 years ago is pretty nice and pretty clear. So I wanted to set up just a couple of those calls before we play them. I have a call with Bob Haldeman. If any of you remember Haldeman, he was like the main chief of staff to Nixon, and basically he controlled all of the inner workings of the Nixon administration. But this particular call, I went ahead and played it through after I connected Haldeman and Nixon. And at this time, I think it was in about 1971. And if you remember 71 or 72, Nixon had Watergate was going on, the Vietnam War was going on. He was ready for the re-election in 72. So of all the things that Haldeman and Nixon could have talked about on this phone call, we'll play it through. And actually Haldeman is explaining, or Nixon is explaining to Haldeman how the student protesters at the Capitol building, how they couldn't get inside the Capitol building, but instead as a protest, they threw up on the bushes. They vomited on the bushes. So Haldeman is saying, well, how did they do that? How did they do that? And Nixon is explaining how you can make yourself vomit. Which I thought was interesting, because all the things that was going on in this phone call was about how they vomit. And I have another call that I completed through to George Meany, who was the AFL-CIO. And early on in the Nixon administration, they got quite close. Later on, after Watergate, George Meany was one of Nixon's biggest enemies. But this phone call is interesting because, you know, they're slapping each other on the back and everything. So with no further ado, I think Bob has the audio pumped all the way up. So be quiet, don't breathe for 5 minutes, and you'll be able to hear the calls.
Yes, please. Operator, I'd like to talk to Mr. Al Cap, CAPP. I think Mr. Colson's office of the White House operator may have the number. I don't know.
Very fine. I believe we do have the number, sir. Hello? Mr. President, he is out of his house for about a half an hour. Would you like us to leave word and have him return the call?
Yeah, I will be over in Birch by that time.
All right, fine, sir.
You can return it to me there.
Very fine.
Could you try Secretary Connolly for me, please?
Certainly, sir. Yes, please.
Colson, please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Colson should be to a phone in about a half an hour. If you'd like us to return the call.
Fine, okay. Hello?
Yes, Mr. President, Secretary Connolly is out writing at the present time, and we've left word to have him return your call also.
Fine, I'll be at Birch. Okay.
Fine, sir. Yes, please.
Try Dr. Billy Graham, please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Hello?
Sir, Mr. Haldeman, please.
Yeah.
Bob Haldeman.
Go ahead, please.
I hadn't heard that she said wasn't it really terrible about what those demonstrators did at the platform. And I said, no, she's well, they went out and vomited into the shrubbery. Did you hear about that? How the demonstrators did? Yeah, there were about 10 of them couldn't get into the Rules Committee meeting, and when they didn't, they went out and vomited into the shrubbery. How did they do that? Well, you know, you can vomit, you know, jackasses. That's incredible. That's good. It is unbelievable. That's unbelievable. That's all right. I told you that. I said, doesn't hurt us a bit. Doesn't hurt us a bit, just... Hello?
Mr. President, Mr. Meany, please.
Hello?
Go ahead, sir.
Hello? Hello, Mr. President. Just wanted to say that in case the White House operator told you that I tried to reach you last night, I'm in Camp David. I didn't have any big thing, but I learned from one of my spies that you and your grandson had your birthday yesterday, so I just wanted to congratulate you. Well, thank you very much. And you're really lucky to have a boy. He's born the same day you were. Same day, and but just a few years after you. I'll tell you a little story. We had a little ice cream and cake last night. My daughter said, she reads the paper, she said, well, Daddy, you're a crusty old 78. And the kid looked up and he says, and I'm a crusty old 5. That's great. Thank you very much. Right. I don't know if you... Is it raining down there? Or? Yes, it's sort of busy. We're fog in up here. I tried to put some words together for an acceptance speech. Yeah. Hard work. Well, anyway, you're the boy my best. All right, thank you very much. Bye.
Okay, I'll just make note of you saw the tape recorder during those phone calls, and that was, at the time, was a state-of-the-art tape recorder. They tried 3 or 4 different taping systems with Nixon, and he was pretty much a bumbler, like I am, on electronics and technology. So they said, Mr. President, all you need to do when you pick up the phone is just hit the record button, and when you're done talking, hit the stop button, and then you'll have the tapes preserved. Well, at Camp David, he had 2 phones that were tied in to the White House tapes. One was in his study, and one was at his desk a little bit beyond his study. So he could use either phone, and those were the only phones where his conversations were being recorded. But after trial and error, they decided to go with that state-of-the-art recorder that was actually voice activated. So what that meant, when the president picked up his phone, at Aspen, which was his living quarters, the red light would come on our switchboard. So as soon as he picked up the phone, the recording started, which is why, fortunately, all of the switchboard operators' voices were put on the tapes. So I don't know if you noticed, but I thought it was surprisingly clear, the audio after 50 years, you know. So I thought I'd throw that in. That's why I am on the White House tapes. So I'm going to go here and go back. But so how did I get involved with the White House? Graduated from college in 1969, summer of '69, and we all know what happened that summer. The draft was still in place, and if you graduated from college, you lost your student deferment. So, and most everybody in the Army that got drafted, you could almost guarantee you're going to have a couple of years. Part of that service is going to be in Vietnam. So I'm on the list of the 20,000, 40,000, the reserves, the National Guard. I actually got hired right out of college as a sports writer in Davenport, Iowa. So I began my career as a sports writer. And here you see here I am, press row at a high school basketball game. Notice the slacks and the Beatle haircut. And Uncle Sam needs you, right? Uncle Sam needs you. Well, sure enough, I was one of the last ones to get drafted right before the lottery came into place in 1970. So I did get my orders for the Army. Well, a recruiter said, you know, you've got a college degree, why don't you enlist, do a 3-year term, and then maybe you'll have a choice of where you're going to go. You may not be sent to Vietnam. So I thought, that's a pretty good idea. And I had visions of serving most of my time at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which is where they published the Army Times. I thought, I'll be sitting behind a typewriter, the Army Times, clear sailing. So anyway, I'm sent to Fort, in the meantime, I'm engaged to this lovely lady here. We've been married last August 51 years now. So this is Karen. And she's got the clock, so my presentation doesn't run over, because I do have a tendency to talk quite extensively. But anyway, I get drafted. I give Karen an engagement ring. She says yes. I said, by the way, honey, I'm going into the Army. So at any rate, she kept the ring, fortunately. So how I got involved with WACA. I'm at basic training, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We're probably 2 weeks into training. And we see this notice that there's going to be some people coming in. Not a lot of information, but going to be a highly classified assignment. And if you want to get out of 2 hours of training, and basic training is pretty tough in the Army. And how many Army folks we got? Air Force, Marines, Navy. Well, a lot of Navy here. Well, it's Camp David is a naval facility, so I appreciate the naval support. But anyway, you know, everybody's trying to get out. Everybody's trying to get out of the service. So this call they had, there were 500 of the basic training troops that showed up in this huge auditorium. Got out of whatever training we were doing that day. So we had a couple of guys in white shirts and suits, and they told a little bit about what the assignment was going to be, but not a whole lot. They did say, we can tell you right now, gentlemen, if you were ever involved with drugs, marijuana, you just as well not show up for the next day's meeting. And we're talking about the 60s. I think 90 to 95% of the troops in the room had some experiences there. So it was interesting. The second meeting, that group of 500 dwindled down to about 75. So they told us a little more information, the 75, and told us it would be working for the White House. And as it turned out of those initial 500 at Fort Campbell, they chose 3 for assignment to work at the White House. Fortunately, I was one of the 3. So they needed, at that time, they needed a lot of support people, because Nixon was going to be doing a lot of campaigning in the 1970 midterm elections before the next re-election in '72. So they sent me from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, they sent me to Fort Gordon, Georgia to attend Switchboard school. So here I am at the barracks with my Army haircut, and I'm reading the Augusta, actually this is at Fort Gordon. At Fort Campbell, they'd sent me to Fort Gordon. I did my switchboard training, and then I was on what they called White House hold. So they assign you different duties around the base, and they said, you will get orders. Once your clearance is done, you will get, or right after you're done with your 8-week training, you will get orders, but don't worry about that, because they'll be revoked, and you'll be put on what they called White House hold, which is you're basically waiting for your clearance to go through before you're assigned. So sure enough, I finished my 8 weeks at Fort Gordon, and I get the orders that I'm going to be a switchboard operator. See if that red light, where's that red, how's that red, there it is. I was going to be a switchboard operator at Long Binh Airport in Vietnam. You can see the city of Long Binh, and then the airport's right here. Well, those were the longest 2 hours, I think, in my life. But sure enough, 2 hours later, my orders were revoked. I was put on White House hold. So, see, we'll go back here. This was the sports writer. So anyway, after I got the orders, flew home. We got married in August. This is Karen. And we shuttled ourselves back. I'll say one thing. I flew in, I actually drove a car out to the East Coast, and they said, check in at the White House Communications headquarters. We're almost absolutely certain we're going to use you at the White House. Well, they have what they call a White House signal board in the basement of the White House. So I was going to be working for 2 years in the basement of the White House on the White House switchboard. So in the meantime, I went across the river, and a lot of the White House communications and staffers lived in apartments and condos in Arlington, Virginia. So I put a deposit down for an apartment, and they said, well, call back before you fly back, because I was flying back to get married. They said, call back just to make sure. So I called back the morning, my flight was at noon back to Iowa to get married, and they said, well, we've decided we're going to use you at Camp David. I said, well, I've got this apartment in Arlington. It was $252 a month. Army pay for housing back then was $105 a month. So anyway, they were very reasonable. I got my deposit back. He said, we'll send you up to Camp David. There's a lovely old lady that's a realtor there, and she just loves all the White House guys. So I called Karen, delayed my flight a day, drove up to Camp David, and sure enough, she found me a little apartment, starter apartment, flew back, we got married, then we drove Karen's car back to Camp David with a U-Haul trailer. So we honeymooned from Iowa, Ohio, back to Camp David. There was our wedding picture. Nice picture. And that's an army haircut, believe it or not. They were allowed. Very hot day in August in Davenport, Iowa. And my hairdo was, but Karen, my lovely bride. So here we are. Here's my Army uniform to the far right, and we kind of did a hokey welcome to Waka with the Nixon peace sign. This was my White House pass, and that was actually that's the photo that was used. So that's what they let us have. I don't know when Mark, if they still let your hair go a little bit longer. Yeah. Okay, so the White House switchboard, the Camp David switchboard. Everybody knows the gal on the right? Lily Tomlin. Yeah. 1 ringy-dingy, 2 ringy-dingies. Hello, is this the person to whom I am speaking? Everybody remembers her bit. Well, oddly enough, this switchboard they used on Laugh-In looked very, very similar to our switchboard at Camp David. So some of the guys, Laugh-In was still very popular back in the 70s. So a lot of us said, we plug into the president and we say, is this the president to whom I am speaking? And this is not one of the White House switchboard, but this is very close to what we had at Camp David. And you can see all these cords. You may have 25 cords going, and we would have a little row of lights. Maybe 4 or 5 lights would be right at the top, and they'd be the red lights. This is the Camp David switchboard. They would be, every time that red light came on, you knew that was one of the president's phones. So on the right was actually one of our trip switchboards. I went probably on 16, 17 presidential trips all over the world, and we had what we called the mini board. So we installed a little switchboard like this, which had direct lines back to Washington, D.C., and everybody on the White House staff, when they arrived at the city, they all had direct phones right off of this switchboard, secure phones. And of course, the presidential suite, he had a couple of phones in the presidential suite. So we did the little strips up, so we knew, who was calling. They would be right underneath the little. So this is a typical switchboard, and we probably would set up at an airport or a hotel room. They'd take everything out of the hotel room, and then our tech people would set up the switchboard. We became operational then 24 hours a day. And when before Air Force took off from Washington, D.C., say he's in Denver. So we have the switchboard set up probably 5 days before the trip. So we're flying out, our staff, Secret Service, and all the White House staff advanced people are flying out. So we're answering the switchboard. We would answer Denver signal. The very moment that Nixon would touch down in Air Force One, we were no longer Denver signal. We would answer the phones Denver White House. So we were the traveling White House and for Nixon. So suddenly Denver signal became Denver White House. So this is what we call the Black Beauty, the 500 sets. I don't know if they had them still when you were there, Mark. They did. But we put the little discs in the center of the phone. And if at Camp David, that's the Camp David disc. So they are rotary dial, but they're actually connected, so you could not dial anything. As soon as you picked up, you would connect with us either on the trip site at our mini switchboard, or at Camp David, you'd connect directly to our Camp David switchboard. So the photo on the right, they are my right, stage left. This is called the White House Admin Board. So this is located in the Executive Office building, which is next door to the White House. So remember, the signal board is in the basement of the White House. Well, the story goes, and I believe it to be true, before LBJ took office, all the presidential phone calls went through the signal board at the basement of the White House. When LBJ got into office, he picked up the telephone and heard one of the Army guys at the signal switchboard in the basement of the White House, and the story I heard, LBJ says in his Texas drawl, well, I don't want to pick up a phone and talk to some Army guy or some military guy. I want to pick up a phone and talk to a female switchboard operator. So within a couple of weeks, all the president's calls went through to the gals next door, and we handled pretty much the military calls. Occasionally, we would handle some, but most of the calls went through the White House admin board, which for me was kind of nice, because at Camp David, we handled all the presidential calls. There were, they all went through us. So I think I had like 150, 200 calls where the guys that worked downstairs at the White House, they never really interacted with the president. They had all the top military they did. So here's the entry sign to Camp David, top of a mountain, 40 miles or so north of Washington, D.C. It's a Navy-supported facility, which I thought was interesting. The Navy handled the camp maintenance. The Marines handled the guard duty at the front gate. Army pretty much handled the switchboard and communications. And we had a comm center, we had radio, we had a bunch of different areas. The service that Mark did in White House communications, we didn't even have that. We had no computers, we had no cell phones at the time. So this is the Camp David sign. And for those of you that don't know, Camp David initially was called Camp Shangri-La. And when Dwight Eisenhower came into office, he renamed Camp Shangri-La, he renamed it to Camp David after his father, who was named David Eisenhower, and his grandson, who was David Eisenhower also. So this is young David Eisenhower underneath the sign at Camp David. So this is a little cottage we got in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. The Army guys, they were the only ones at Camp David that didn't have to live in the barracks at Camp David. So we could live off camp. So I was like 10 miles down the mountain in Blue Ridge Summit near Fort Ritchie, if anybody's familiar with the Army base in Maryland, Fort Ritchie. So we had this nice little cottage, $95 a month rent for this little cottage. So I'm making money on my $125 housing allowance versus the $225 down in Arlington, Virginia. So I still play senior softball. This is a world championship ring. I've been playing senior softball for 25 years. So I got on the Camp David fast pitch softball team. I play slow pitch now because we're all older now. But at the time I played on the fast pitch team. This is my little dog, called him Bogey. He was there, but we had this, I think, was it maybe 800 square foot, Karen? This little house, little cabin. But because I worked at Camp David, I had 3 telephones in this little house. And only one of them rang because we had the deal, you know, with the phone company. If you took the ringer off, they couldn't tell that you had 3 telephones. So I could maybe take 10 steps and have another telephone. So here's Camp David. This is Aspen. This is the Presidential Lodge. And when Eisenhower was in office, he loved to golf. There's a little golf course here. It had been taken out when LBJ came into office. But here's all the cabins at Camp David. There's the barracks I talked about. Front gate is right here. Now we had, right in this area, there's like a 12-story water tower. And it even said water tower at the top. But believe me, it was not a water tower. This is where we had all of our communications, secure communications with the concrete walls. So our switchboard, our Camp David switchboard, was probably 40 feet underground. So to access the switchboard, you had to go down the stairs, you had to do the right key code, and then this blast door opened. So our switchboard was in the basement of that water tower. So here's Nixon and Pat and the 3 dogs at Camp David, walking the trails at Camp David. And this is an overhead shot of Camp David. Whoops. This is the Presidential Lodge. The golf course would have been like right around here, so Nixon had a big pool put in right in this area. So these are the different cabins. The front gate is over here. This is the water tower. But inside that water tower were all this secret communications equipment. And again, our switchboard was underground. And at the time, there was actually a tunnel that went from the water tower underground all the way to Nixon's Lodge at Camp David. Well, now this water tower no longer exists. It's been torn down. So this is maybe 52 years ago at Camp David. So on the left, my right, this is Bill Clinton, and I think it's Madeleine Albright. This is actually the Camp David bowling alley, which was a 2-laner. When Nixon came into office, they had pin setters that would reset the pins. And Nixon loved to bowl. And he used it so much, but he didn't want to spend all the time, so we got automatic pin setters while Nixon was in office. So we had a Camp David bowling league that bowled on Tuesday nights at this facility. Quite competitive because we had Marines, Navy, and Army. We had about 5 or 6 teams. But if the president was at Camp David, regardless of whether he was going to bowl or not, our bowling league was canceled in the event he wanted to use the bowling lanes. So I think we were probably the only bowling league in America that got canceled because the president was nearby. So this is actually the bowling facility at the White House. And this is Nixon. So he was a pretty good bowler. But again, that's the actual Camp David bowling alley. This is the bowling alley at the White House. Christmas is at Camp David. I spent a couple of Christmases. Nixon loved to come to Camp David at Christmas. So I had several times during the Christmas holiday. I think maybe one Christmas. I don't want to say several because I was only there for maybe 2 or 3 Christmases. But I was there at Camp David with Nixon. And this is typical of one of the cabins. I think if I recall, the military aide that accompanied Nixon on all of his trips, he would also come to Camp David. This was his, and you can see November, December, some of the snow that we would have. I would be going up to Camp David and there might be 20 inches of snow on the ground. So he always left a little early. So there's a pool I referred to with Aspen, the Nixon Lodge. And this was, many of you have maybe seen this. This was later on in the Nixon administration. This is the study at Camp David, looking out the window in deep thought over who knows what. Now this was interesting. Tricia Nixon, Nixon's daughter, and Ed Cox, who was actually in the Navy at the time, they got married, and and it's almost been 50 years ago. In fact, our anniversary, I think Karen and I were married 6 months longer than Tricia and Ed. But they had the big White House ceremony, the big White House wedding, and all of the press in the Washington, D.C. area, there was all of this stuff about where is the couple going to do their honeymoon? Well, the betting choice was at Key Biscayne, which is the Florida White House, and they were going to go on to the Bahamas just off the Florida coast. And so everything was kind of set up there. And, but they did an about face. They ended up spending 2 weeks at Camp David at the retreat. And so we were getting calls from all of the White House people, all the press people, and we were instructed, if we were called and say, are Tricia and Eddie here on their honeymoon? We were instructed to lie to the media and say, no, they're not there. And me being a writer at a newspaper, I'm not used to being lied to. Maybe that was the precursor to Watergate. Who knows? But we called that Tricia Gate, the big caper. So at any rate, I probably talked with Ed and Tricia a lot during the 2 weeks we were at Camp David, and Tricia loved to play games with Ed. She would go to another cabin at Camp David. She'd pick up a telephone. She'd let us know at the switchboard where she was, but she said, don't tell Eddie where I am. If he calls, wants to know where I am, say, you don't know. So now we're lying again, right? But Ed being a Navy guy, he wasn't really popular with the Navy support people at Camp David, because before they got married, Tricia and Eddie would come in. They were staying at different cabins. I don't know if, a lot of times they picked up the phone in the same cabin, so who knows what was going on there. But Ed would always bring 2 or 3 duffel bags of laundry when they came to Camp David, and he'd have the Navy staff do his laundry. So, and I'll tell you a little story about their son, Chris Cox, which is Nixon's grandson. I'll tell you a little story about that later. So I had probably 3 or 4 trips to the Western White House in San Clemente. What would happen at San Clemente, they only operated like 8 hours a day because the president wasn't there. We were the only switchboard, only communication source at Camp David, so we operated 24 hours a day, whether the president was there or not. You could not communicate at Camp David unless you went through our switchboard. So when the president would go to the Western White House, which he did quite often, they would send support operators, because we became a 24-hour operation then. So like I say, I had probably 3 or 4 trips to the Western White House. So this is La Casa Pacifica. The ocean, there's a couple steps down here. The Pacific Ocean is right down here on the wall. This is a helicopter pad where Air Force One or Marine One would land after Air Force One would land at El Toro, the Air Force base. Then the helicopter would go from El Toro to this helicopter pad. Our switchboard was this little building right here. We were the first building. Actually, it's this building. And then beyond that, Nixon had an office. So you can see how close we were. You know, when they would arrive, he would have a golf cart, which would take you right down to the Western White House. Another view of the Western White House. This is the main residence, La Casa Pacifica. This is our switchboard room. Had a room. Nixon had an office here. The helicopter pad is here. This is the 5 freeway. Those of you who've been to Southern California, this is the 5 freeway. We always stayed at the San Clemente Inn, which was just 2 miles from the Western White House, so we were very close. And we basically worked 8-hour shifts. You worked 8 to 5, 5 to midnight, or midnight to 8 on the switchboard. So this is some of the shrubbery walking down to the main house at the Western White House, the Republican elephant. And this is Nixon when he would arrive at the helipad, which they always had flowers for Pat. They had the golf cart waiting, and then he would be golf carted back down to the residence. So this is me on your left, and another switchboard operator, actually from Camp David. So when it was kind of a dead time, we looked around and walked out of the switchboard building and said, let's just have someone take a picture of us in front of Army 1 as if we had just arrived and we were VIPs and everything. So fortunately, the Secret Service didn't call us out on that. We got away right after the picture. We skedaddled out of the way. So of course, everybody knows this is 26,000. It's 26,000. If Nixon's on board, if the President is on board, this is Air Force One. I did not fly on Air Force One. I think Mark may have. Mark never didn't get close. This is what we flew on. This was called the C-141. You people that were in the Air Force, you know the cargo plane. This transported all of our communications equipment through the back. As you know, the back opened. So the presidential limousine, usually there were 2, they were driven up into the front of this area. The helicopter oftentimes would also be aboard. So our first class seating on Air Force One were these little jump seats along the side, little flip down jump seats, no windows on the aircraft. It was always either way too hot or way too cold in the cargo plane. But, and we would oftentimes travel 5 or 6 days before the president. But this is the way we traveled. Except for one trip. In 1970, again, I said Nixon campaigned an awful lot. So they were needing switchboard operators everywhere at different sites. So the only available transportation they had was LBJ's vice presidential jet. So, and this is LBJ, of course, in his plane. So I got to travel with this other switchboard operator. I think we were going to maybe Phoenix or somewhere. So we got to travel in LBJ's VP jet. So, and you Air Force guys know what kind of, I have no idea what kind of jet that was, but you Air Force guys, I probably do. So we go from the Western White House to the other coast, the Florida White House at Key Biscayne. I was able to serve probably 3 or 4 trips at Key Biscayne at the Florida White House. This is Key Biscayne. Okay, right here, that's the helipad. This is Biscayne Bay, and off to your right would be Miami Beach, the skyline of Biscayne Bay. So Nixon would arrive at Homestead Air Force Base, which you Air Force guys are familiar with that. He would then take the helicopter right to here. And this little row of houses here, there were about five houses at Key Biscayne. The top house was B.B. Rebozo's house, his longtime personal friend. And right next to B.B. was the Nixon house. Next to the Nixon house was our switchboard house. And so we maintained that switchboard 24 hours a day when the president was there. And also the military aide had a bedroom at this house. The fourth house was like our White House Communications Command Central. And then the fifth house was the Secret Service house. So again, we usually stayed somewhere at a hotel here at Key Biscayne, and you went through and there's a Marine security gate to get into the Nixon compound. So we had cards on all of our trips. So staff that would come, nobody obviously stayed at Key Biscayne unless it was family. They all stayed at the nearby Key Biscayne hotels, but we always gave them a card on how they could reach the White House switchboard. And those that were top staffers, they had direct lines from their hotel rooms right to the Key Biscayne switchboard. So that's on the far left is Nixon and Pat. And this is actually his house. And the switchboard house, you know, I say the switchboard house is right next door, but you couldn't see anything of Nixon's because the house is over here. So these palm trees pretty much, and BB's house was over here. So this little area is a little waiting area if Nixon would want to come out and wade out into Biscayne Bay. So one trip I'm working the midnight shift over here at the house, and usually about sunrise I would pull open the blinds. They had double door windows, and I'd look out on Biscayne Bay and look across at Miami Beach, and it'd be a beautiful scene about 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30. So one morning I got up and I looked out right around in this area, and I see all these bubbles. And I can't figure out what these bubbles are. And then, so I called the Secret Service to report it to the Secret Service, and they're running the same deal. There's somebody up all night at the Secret Service. So I said, yeah, there's bubbles out in front of the residence. I don't know what's going on, but I thought I'd let you know. They said, well, thank you, but they said that's actually Navy frogmen. They had nets all around this little area. They were actually shark nets. So every morning, just after sunrise, the frogmen would go around the whole perimeter of these nets to just make sure there was no penetration, no holes in the nets. And somebody said the Democrats were out there with the scissors and cutting holes in the net. So I don't think that was true. Again, Key Biscayne, this was the hotel where we always stayed at on the right. This was Crandon Courts. And this is the end of Key Biscayne. They had a lighthouse there at the very end of Key Biscayne. And you can tell those of you who are familiar with Florida, how Butch knows, he lived in Florida for a long time, but the wind would pick up and it'd be a big thunderstorm and then it'd clear off and be hot and humid. So I took a trip to Ottawa, Canada, and they have what they would call a check ride. So there's usually a lead switchboard operator on each trip. He doesn't really work the board, but he coordinates with the Bell telephone people. He's in all the meetings. So I had my very few Camp David switchboard operators got to be what they call a trick chief, or the lead switchboard on presidential trips. The trip to Ottawa, Canada, I shared a room with the lead switchboard, and that was my check ride. So I was going to get certified to be the head switchboard guy on some of the trips. So I attended all the meetings. So again, I made mention that these cards went out, the little cards of the key people. This was the Ottawa Signal Board. And then once Air Force One touched down, became the Ottawa White House. And this was actually when I attended de Gaulle's funeral in 71 in Paris. These were the cards we passed out to the key staffers that needed to reach the switchboard in Paris. So I might mention that trip to Paris. It was very unusual. I was still pretty new at Camp David, so I was coming off the midnight shift at Camp David. Karen had found a job at the local insurance company in our little town. She's making more money than I'm making in the Army. That's not surprising, is it? But I get back, and Karen's already at work. I get back after my midnight shift. I've just got to sleep. At 9:30, I get a phone call, and they said, well, we need switchboard operators for a presidential trip to Paris. Are you interested? And I'm half asleep. And I said, sounds good to me. So they said, well, pack your bags. We'll have a driver come to your house and take you down to D.C. And of course, then we had to get our shots. We had to get our passport. So I had worked the midnight shift, so hadn't really slept. So got down to D.C., got my shots. By the time we got out to Andrews Air Force Base, it was 6 p.m. the next day. Or that same day, but it was 6 p.m. before the C-141 took off for Paris. Well, the C-141s can make pretty good time, so we arrived at Paris in 6 hours, but it was 6 a.m. the next day in Paris. And usually on a trip, international trip like that, we would go maybe 10 days in advance. Well, the president was coming in 4 days because de Gaulle had just died. So I basically didn't sleep because as soon as we got there, it was 6 a.m. local time, so we had to get the switchboard up and running, and all the world leaders were coming in, and it was a whole different deal with than you would normally see because it's de Gaulle's funeral. So another trip that I got on, Nixon was going to the grand opening of Walt Disney World in Florida. So I managed to get on that trip. So we flew into Homestead, and at that time, I don't know if many of you have probably been to the complex in Florida, but this was Roy Disney, Walt's brother. Walt was not alive at the time, but Walt, of course, created Disneyland in Anaheim. So Roy wanted to create something similar on the East Coast in Florida. So this was Roy's big challenge. So we got down, there was only 2 hotels at Disney World at the time, 2 brand new hotels, the Contemporary Resort and the Polynesian Village. Well, we stayed at the Polynesian Village. We had a little switchboard set up there. We were there like 5 days before Nixon was going to come down for the grand opening. So they had all the worldwide press. They had these lavish buffets, lavish parties, all you can eat, all you can drink for the worldwide press. They were also there at the same time, and all the staff that was going to operate the Disney Resort, they were there, and then the White House people were there. Well, we were issued passes that we could go on all the rides at Disney World. It wasn't open to the public yet, but we could go on all the rides. So I knew at the Contemporary, that's where all the big, massive press deals were. So I still had my little press card from the newspaper I worked at Davenport, Iowa, my photo ID. So I told my roommate, I said, let's take the monorail over to the Contemporary Resort where they're having this tremendous, lavish, thousands of press from the world. And I'll say, don't you say anything, and I'll talk the talk and walk the walk, and I'll see if I can get us into the thing. And I showed my little card that says I was a sports writer at Davenport, Iowa, welcomed right in with I said, this is my photographer. He didn't have a camera, but. So we were with all the worldwide press and, like I say, lavish buffet, but back then, it's not like that, obviously not like that today, but they wanted so much media for Disney World and I did have something that showed I was a member of the press, and so I was welcomed in. As it turned out, this of course was a cover of Life magazine when it opened. I think it was something in 1971, but it turned out something happened back in Washington, D.C. the day before, and Nixon called off the trip to Disney World for the big grand opening, and he sent Bob Haldeman, whose picture you saw earlier. Well, we didn't need the presidential support for Haldeman, so our trip officer, overall trip officer, he said, well, Nixon's not coming, tear down all of our equipment, pack it up, and I'm going to make an excuse that we can't get a flight back from Homestead to Andrews until tomorrow. So once you guys tear down, you're free to do whatever you want. So we went back and rode all those rides at Disney World again, and then flew back to Andrews the next day. Okay, here's a switchboard set up in New York City. I worked a lot of midnight shifts. For some reason, they gave the Camp David operators, even though we had talked to Nixon and had handled much more phone calls, we always seemed to get the midnight shift. So I'm working the midnight shift at a hotel in New York. President is staying at the Waldorf Astoria, the presidential suite. So this is probably the second day of the trip. So I'm here, this is probably at, probably about just shortly after midnight. When the afternoon guys were leaving, you know, the shift before was leaving, I said, well, would you take a picture of me, you know? And because I'm working by myself. So I'm reading the New York Times. And then this is obviously a stage photo. I didn't fall asleep on the switchboard, Mr. President. Oh, I didn't see that light there, Mr. President. So that's a stage photo. So Diane Sawyer, I think many of you know Diane Sawyer, ABC correspondent for many, many years, Worldwide News Tonight or whatever it was. Diane was actually part of the White House press staff. She worked for Ron Ziegler, who was the press secretary. So I'm working the switchboard. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. So Diane, this is part of the, you know, the president hadn't arrived yet, but she's setting up all the press stuff for the president's visit to New York. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, I get, Diane had a White House phone in her room, so she picks up. So we got to talking. She was checking to see if she had any messages. So for some reason, she wanted to be very, very chatty. And of course, our job was to, you know, connect the phone calls, no chit chat. But Diane just started talking, and she was a former newspaper reporter before she worked for the White House. And I told, well, that's surprising. I was a former newspaper reporter before I worked for the White House. So our conversation went back and forth, and that's the only time that anybody on the White House staff addressed me by my first name. You know, and we started talking and everything, and she says, well, Mike, she said, are you going to be here same time tomorrow night? And I said, Miss Sawyer, I wouldn't call her Diane, Miss Sawyer, I'm the only one working the midnight shift, so yeah, I'll be here. She said, I'll call you the next night, and we'll chat some more. And sure enough, 12:30 in the morning, Diane Sawyer calls me, you know, and we chatted for a little more. Interestingly enough, when Nixon resigned and went to San Clemente for 2 more years after he was out of office, Diane was part of his staff. She really coordinated in writing the Nixon memoirs. So she actually was at San Clemente from 74 to 76 after Nixon resigned. So she became a part of the Nixon staff later on as well. So I would call that late night chats with Diane Sawyer, or pillow talk with Diane Sawyer. Okay, this is interesting. The photo on the left is Nixon actually at his office at the White House when he called the Apollo 16 astronauts in 1972. And the reason I put that up is the Apollo 15 astronauts. Nixon was at Camp David when the Apollo 15 astronauts were getting ready to blast off for their moon mission. So we're sitting around the switchboard about 6:30 in the evening. The red light comes on, plug in. Yes, Mr. President. Nixon says, operator, would you get me the astronauts down at Cape Kennedy? It was called Cape Kennedy at the time. And Nixon said, I want to talk with each one individually. I said, thank you, Mr. President. So I said, okay, how am I going to do this, right? Now this was before they had the taping system at Camp David. And boy, did I wish that call would have been, you know, on these tapes. But so I called the White House admin board, the ladies I talked to you about at the switchboard next to the White House, And I said, yes, the president wants to talk to the astronauts down at Cape Kennedy. Well, they were all in the training headquarters at the time. So the call, I think, came in, I looked at the presidential call log, it came in at 6 p.m. and at 6:24, we had all 3 astronauts, and that call went through back to Nixon. So, of course, I talked to the 3 astronauts first to make sure, there was good sound quality. And then I rang Nixon back on a separate cord and said, Mr. President, I have the astronauts for you now. And typical Nixon, he, fine. So plugged them in. They only talked for 4 minutes. But that was the call that I was a part of. And the next morning in the newspaper, big headline, Nixon bids Astros Godspeed. And I'm thinking the headline writer didn't have enough room to put astronauts, so they shortened it to Astros. I don't remember if the Houston Astros baseball team was, but at any rate, it talks about that phone call. And the phone call from Camp David, 5 p.m. Central, which was, like I said, 6 p.m. Camp David time. So we always prided ourselves, especially at the Switchboard, to be able to get whoever the president wanted and try to anticipate. So right after that call that Nixon completed, I thought, well, they're blasting off for the moon the next morning. They're going to be in orbit a few days before they land on the moon. And I'm thinking Nixon's going to be at Camp David for a couple of more days. So there's a possibility that he might want to call the astronauts' wives just to reassure them while he's at Camp David. So right after we completed the call, I called back down to the White House admin board and I said, I don't know for sure, but I think the president may talk to the wives. Could you connect me back to the training headquarters of the 3 astronauts? So she did, and I talked with them again. 2 of them were married. I got their home phone numbers. One had a girlfriend. I don't think he was married, but he gave me the girlfriend's number. So I had a little Post-it note that I put up on the switchboard for the next shift that came in, that here are the astronauts' wives' phone numbers. Well, there was another article that I don't have with me, but there was another article that said that President Nixon was the last civilian type, non-NASA type, that talked to the astronauts before they lifted off for the moon. So I showed that scrapbook back in California. I said, no, Nixon was not the last one to talk to the astronauts. I was the last one to talk to the astronauts. So at the Nixon Library, they've got an exhibit that you can actually pick up the phone and you can hear Nixon's call, the one that he made from the White House. Again, this was Apollo 16, which Nixon was at the White House when he made that call. So these were the Apollo 15 astronauts. I just put through this in. These are the ones that I talked to when they were in their training quarters before they blasted off for the moon. And it's funny because I've read a lot of the books about the administration and this particular phone call. And one of the things that Nixon said, again, this call was not recorded, but Nixon said, well, I'll be up and I'll be watching the liftoff. Well, the liftoff was very early in the morning down in Florida at Cape Kennedy. And we're at the switchboard, and Nixon didn't even wake up until 10 o'clock that morning. They'd already blasted off for the moon, but Nixon, well, I'll be watching here at Camp David. I'll be watching the liftoff. Well, he wasn't watching. All right, everybody remembers Woody Hayes, right? The venerable old football coach at Ohio State. Well, Woody, he hated Michigan. He hated Bo Schembechler, and they were the 2 best football teams in the Big Ten for many, many years. So I put this slide up, and when Woody says, we can read it, about he's not going to cross over into Ohio to buy any gas. Well, I had known Woody from my last year before I was a sports writer, so I covered University of Iowa football, Big Ten. So I had interfaced with Woody. He's actually a fraternity member of mine, different school. Woody went to Miami of Ohio, Sigma Chi. I went to University of Iowa, Sigma Chi. So we were fraternity brothers. Well, interestingly enough, Nixon was at Camp David when they had the Ohio State-Michigan end of the season. That was the winner goes to the Rose Bowl. And back then in the 70s, they didn't have a gazillion bowl games. If you're in the Big Ten, you had to win the Big Ten or you didn't go to a bowl game. So this was it, the winner goes to the, so we're at the Switchboard. We have a little TV monitor. We're watching the Ohio State-Michigan game. We know Nixon's watching the game. So we're figuring, all right, as soon as the game's over, Nixon's going to pick up the phone. He had a pretty strong relationship with Woody, not so much with Bo. But sure enough, Ohio State won the game 20-9. Seconds after the final gun sounded, here's Nixon. I punched my cord in. Yes, sir. Well, would you get me Coach Hayes, please? Thank you, Mr. President. So, of course, he drops off, and then you get the party, and then you connect them. So I had already had phone numbers for the locker room at Ohio State, the locker room at Michigan. And back then, they had one payphone. That's all they had right outside the locker room. So again, we're trying to be heads up on our toes, so we're prepared. So that particular call, I didn't have to go through the gals at the White House because I had the direct line number. So I called the locker room at Ohio State, and I think it was like a trainer maybe answered the phone. A lot of commotion, the victorious, they're going to the Rose Bowl. So I said to the trainer that picked up the phone, I said, this is the White House calling. Could you get Coach Hayes for the president, please? And if this trainer didn't have to go to the bathroom, he had to go to the bathroom right away. He said, oh, sir, yes, sir. He said, he's doing a press conference now, but we'll get him to the phone as soon as we can. So I said, fine. So he comes back about a minute later, and he says, sir, he's going to be with you shortly. So I'm dropping my voice and trying to do my best Nixon impersonation I can. I said, well, okay, fine. So a few seconds later, I get this very excited caller on the other end, and he says, hello. And I dropped my voice as low as I could to do my best Nixon impersonation. I said, Coach Hayes? And Woody says, yes, Mr. President. And I said, one moment for the president. So I got Nixon on the other line and said, sir, I have Coach Hayes for you now. And of course, fine. So I often tell people when we have this clipping that I have in a scrapbook back in California that Woody Hayes thought I was President Nixon. Okay, Henry Kissinger is still alive. He used to be 5'7", and I think now he's 5'1". But the guy on the right is Luke Nichter. And Luke is the one that authored the White House tapes. He transcribed all those tape recordings. And I met Luke several times. In fact, I bought his book, The White House Tapes from 71 to 72. And Luke is a lot younger, so all of his research, all of the Nixon stuff all happened when he was like in grade school or something like that. So I spent a lot of time with Luke one night after a presentation at the Nixon Library, just talking with him, and he was so intrigued to talk with somebody that was actually involved at the time, 50 years ago, with the Nixon tapes. And the reason I got Dr. Kissinger there, one of the first calls I ever handled working at Camp David was Dr. Kissinger. I was probably at Camp David maybe 3 months. So the party, the Marine One had arrived, and Kissinger had his cabin. And at the time, Nancy was his girlfriend. Later he married her, but she had a separate cabin. So no sooner than they all arrived at their cabins, Dr. Kissinger picks up the phone, and I said, yes, sir. And with his German accent, I had no clue what he was saying. He said, wash your shaving cream. And I said, excuse me, sir? And he said, operator, wash your shaving cream. And I was too embarrassed to have him repeat it again. So I said, oh, well, thank you, sir. And I thought, what the hell did he say? So I called his girlfriend, Nancy, who was later his wife. Nancy's in another cabin. And I explained the situation, and I said, boy, I just really had a hard time understanding what he wanted. And she said, well, she said, I do know that he prefers brushless shaving cream. And I said, you know, I think that's what he said. I hope that's what he said. And I thanked her. So then I called one of the Navy stewards and I said, could you get some brushless shaving cream to Dr. Kissinger's cabin? And please call me when it's been delivered. So I get a call 5 minutes later from the Navy steward. We've delivered the shaving cream to Dr. Kissinger's cabin. So I'm fearful that in the next 5 or 10 minutes I'm going to get this call from Dr. Kissinger that I totally messed up what was supposed to be, but that's what he wanted. So that was a kind of a nice break. This on the left was the recorder that I was talking about, the voice-activated recorder. And this was the Nixon tapes book, the memoir, or the transcriptions that Luke Nichter. So he actually gave a presentation at the Nixon Library and was selling copies of his book. He was autographing the copies. So I had talked to Luke, and we talked a lot, and he was intrigued to talk to somebody that was actually involved with the phone calls. So when the inside jacket of the book, he put for CDO Mike, and on all the transcriptions, CDO was the initials for Camp David operator. So I mean, I can go through the book and see where when the president was at Camp David, and CDO, that would be the Camp David operator. So Luke said, the real expert on the tapes, best wishes, Luke Nichter. That was about 4 years ago. I mentioned Bob Haldeman, and he was very demanding person. Basically, he controlled the White House. He controlled the Nixon White House. And some people say Nixon got into a lot of trouble with Watergate, but it was the people that he surrounded himself with. I never had a problem ever with Nixon on the telephone. Haldeman was a different story. I mean, he controlled who could see the president. Any phone calls for President Nixon, unless it was the family, any phone calls for President Nixon had to be screened first through Bob Haldeman. So Haldeman pretty much controlled the White House. He passed away, and he served some time in prison. He was one of the staffers with Chuck Colson, John Mitchell, and Bob Haldeman. They had some prison time. Well, his wife, his widow, Jo Haldeman, she had a presentation at the Nixon Library, and her book was In the Shadow of the White House, her memoirs. And she was, we called her the woman behind the man behind the president, was Jo Haldeman. So she signed, and she's very alert. She was still living in Northern California. When she signed in my book there, she said, you can see, you had a little thing, like I said, to Mike. And so she would sign the book, and I told her I was a Camp David operator, and she said, you know, Bob and I just enjoyed so many times we were at Camp David, and we stayed in Aspen. Well, Aspen was the president's cabin. And I said, well, I don't think you stayed in Aspen because that's where the president stayed. I said, I think your cabin was Sycamore. And she, oh, you're right. You know, what am I thinking? So she said to Mike, with fond memories of Sycamore at Camp David, Jo Haldeman. So that was kind of a special treasure. Back to the China trip. Are we doing okay on time? I'm almost wrapping up here. Back to the China trip. And of course, this was a landmark thing for the Nixon administration, the trip to China. Shortly after it was announced, we dispatched a whole bunch of people to China. And at that time, China was not very developed at all. So there were a couple of our operators from Camp David that went to China for 28 days. At the time, I was the second in command of the Switchboard at Camp David, and my boss, of course, first in command. But Nixon spent all of these weekends prior to the China trip at Camp David discussing the logistics of the China trip. So they were not going to send either myself or my boss to China because Nixon, one of us had to be at Camp David because Nixon was there. So what they did is my boss ended up getting a trip. This was in February of 1972. That was the China trip. My boss got assigned to Honolulu, Hawaii, which was the refueling stop from Andrews, Honolulu, and then China. I got assigned to the refueling stop on the way home, February, Anchorage, Alaska. So those of us from Colorado, we know what the climate is in February in Colorado. So anyway, we left Andrews. We were in Anchorage for 9 days. We arrived in Anchorage before Nixon had left for the trip to China, and we were just the 2-hour refueling stop at Elmendorf in Anchorage. And I think we had our switchboard. Nearby was Fort Richardson in Anchorage. So, you know, he was only going to touch down in Anchorage for like 2 hours, refuel, and then go back to Andrews. But this is the one and only time I have ever been on snow skis, which people say, well, that's why you live in Colorado now, you snow ski. This was at, I think it was at Fort Richardson, the Army base. And I'm at the top of the beginner slope, and I'm looking down and I'm seeing all these 4- and 5-year-old kids going down the beginner slope, and they're doing all the slaloms and everything. So I'm waiting until it's clear because I'm going straight down into the snowdrift because I can't turn. So anyway, I survived that trip. At the Nixon Library, they have an exhibit where it shows Nixon at the Great Wall, and you can jump in, and of course Karen had the camera, and I said, take a picture of me and Pat and President Nixon at the Great Wall. So I have some of the things I brought in the back table, if we're done, if you want to take a peek at them. I've got this here. This was in recognition of the trip to China. And even though I was not on the trip, I did serve as part of that, you know, on the refueling stop. So this was one of the certificates that I brought. And I think I have that paperweight back there. This was very nice. We got these nice paperweights in commemoration of Nixon's visit. And this is probably, I think Mark would agree, this is probably one of our most treasured achievements that we received when we worked for White House Communications, and that was the Presidential Service Certificate and the Presidential Service Badge. This is the letter from the General Hughes. He was a military aide. He was the Air Force military aide to the president, and he just recognized that you have been awarded the Presidential Service Certificate. And this is actually the Presidential Service Badge right here. And what I did is I bought one of these little holders, and I have a photo back in California of the White House. So Karen made a nice little inset there, so my Presidential Service Badge is kind of incorporated with the background of the White House. That's an actual blow-up there of the Presidential Service Badge. Okay, to your left is Larry Higbee, and I've become friends over the years with Larry Higbee. He was the assistant to Bob Haldeman, and I've often told him that I said, Larry, you had one of the most challenging jobs in the White House because Haldeman was a very difficult person to work for. And Higbee, and you got to keep in mind, I'm in my early 20s, Higbee is in his early 20s, and we're in our early 20s working for the President of the United States. So there's a little bit of pressure there. So Higbee, as soon as he would get into a trip site, the first phone call we would get would be from Larry Higbee. And he'd ask to talk to the chief switchboard operator, and he said, I just want to tell everybody, here's the protocol for all of the president's phone calls. They must go through Bob Haldeman. Well, any calls for Bob Haldeman had to go through Larry Higbee first. So I mentioned that I got trip certified. I was the chief switchboard operator on one trip, I think to Ohio, before I left the White House. And sure enough, we're at the hotel, and Higbee's the first one to pick up the phone, ask for the head switchboard operator, so he explains the protocol. So it wasn't 5 minutes later, Chuck Colson is in his hotel room. So he picks up the phone and he said, would you get me Haldeman, please? I said, thank you, sir. Now the protocol, anybody calling for Haldeman, they have to remain on the line. That's Bob Haldeman's instructions. They don't hang up, and then, you know, you return the call. So I'm looking at this light, and Colson's light is still on. I'm watching it closely. So, of course, all of Haldeman's calls has to go first through Higbee, the gentleman on your left. So I called Larry Higbee, and I said, yes, I have Mr. Colson calling for Mr. Haldeman. So Larry says, okay, fine. So I ring Haldeman's room. I'm still looking, make sure that Colson's light is on. So Haldeman said, yes. So I have Mr. Colson for you, sir. And I look up here at this light, and the light goes out on Colson. So Haldeman is clicking on his phone and said, "There's nobody there." I said, "Well, sir, he was just there a minute ago. Let me try to get him back." And so I can hear the phone slamming down in Haldeman's room. So I called Colson's room back, no answer. So shortly thereafter, I get this call from Higbee. He says, or he calls the switch. I want to talk to the head switchboard operator. So I get on the line. He says, "What did you not understand about what I just said about the calls for Haldeman?" I said, "Sir," I said, he was right there on the line. I said, "I know the protocol." And we got blamed for a lot of things that went on because Higbee had to report back to Haldeman. And I still, to this day, I kind of think there was some jealousy among Ehrlichman and Colson because Haldeman had such control over everything. And I kind of think that they might have just been playing games, that Colson picked up the phone and he knew he was supposed to stay on the line for Haldeman, but he hung up and left his room just to kind of get Haldeman excited. But anyway, this photo here is Jack Brennan. He was the Marine military aide to the president, and I've known him now for 50 years. He was actually at the Switchboard house at Key Biscayne. I told you the military aide to the president had a bedroom at our Switchboard house. So I'm working the midnight shift. It's about 2 in the morning. I go to the little kitchen they have, and here comes Jack in his bathrobe. He's coming out to get a cup of coffee. So we chatted for a little bit, and now Jack he's been to several events, so we've talked quite a bit. And actually, when Jack left the White House, he actually left the military at President Nixon's request. When Nixon resigned, he wanted Jack to become his chief of staff as a resigned president at San Clemente at the Western White House. So Jack did assist as well with many of the memoirs. Jack and Diane Sawyer, they remained on as Nixon staffers. And yeah, wrapping it up here, we had our big celebration in Washington, D.C. All of the people that worked, we've been providing presidential communications since 1942. And this is Chris Cox, Nixon's grandson that I told you about. Met and talked with him several times. And he was so happy when I told him some of those stories about his parents at Camp David and his mom playing cat and mouse and his dad bringing the laundry. And he said, "I'm so glad. I never would have known those things about my parents if you wouldn't have told me about those." And we have our Waka reunions. To the left is me at the Gerald Ford Museum and behind the podium. And here I am at the Ronald Reagan Museum, and they actually have a setup at the Reagan Museum where you can go behind the podium and you can see the folks in the audience. There's Barbara Bush. That is Nancy Reagan. Jimmy and Rosalind over on this side. So this is my pitch to run for president. And this is our Waka reunion at the actual Oval Office. They have a replica at the Nixon Library. So that's me at the president's desk. These are all White House that served the same time I was there at Camp David.
Mike, if you go back real quick.
Yeah.
The guy on the far right, I worked with him in the 80s also.
Yeah, Don Camel.
For a long time.
Don Camel, yeah. He was with Waka for probably 16 or 17 years. And we're nearing the end. This was interesting because I was 5 years out of the White House, went back to my job as a sports writer in Davenport, Iowa. Jimmy Carter was having this, he was now the president. He had a thing on a Sunday. He said he had a Call the President's Day. So anybody in the United States could pick up a phone on that Sunday and chat with the president. And I did an article about why that wouldn't work in the Nixon administration. Number one, any call that the White House switchboard didn't recognize, they were automatically sent to the Secret Service. And then I also made reference, any call for the president had to go through Haldeman. So anyway, through the article, I said it wouldn't work because you know, the call, I said, I hope a lot of people got to talk with President Carter, because it wouldn't have worked in the Nixon administration. Final slide. This is the White House switchboard operator today. We don't have a switchboard. Nothing goes out on the road anymore with the president. Everything is done differently today. You know, we've got computers. If Mark gives his presentation, he'll tell you about the computer age with the president. And Walter Cronkite, we all love Walter. This is the day I left the White House. It was November 10th, 1972. And Walter, this is Walter's newscast on November 10th, 1972. Good evening, this is Walter Cronkite reporting for the CBS Television News Network in New York. Today, Specialist 5 Mike Ebbing left the White House. As a Camp David switchboard operator, he returned to civilian duty as a sports writer in Davenport, Iowa. And that's the way it was, this Tuesday, November 10th, 1972. This is Walter Cronkite reporting. Good night. And thank you very much. So anybody, if they can stay a little bit with questions and answers, I'd be happy to. I think I held it to an hour 20. I don't.
You have one or two questions.
Fire away.
Well, when the president was back in the White House, did you stay up at Camp David?
That's a great question, Mike. Great question. In 1971. Nixon spent 26 weekends at Camp David. This was the first year of my marriage. I actually spent more time at Camp David than I did at home with my wife. Now, we carried a little pager, so we were always on call. Myself and the lead switchboard guy at Camp David, we were always on call every weekend. We carried the little pager. If we got a beep, then we knew the president was going to be coming to Camp David. So we had to immediately get up to Camp David. We didn't have to stay overnight at Camp David. As soon as Manolo Sanchez, who was Nixon's personal steward, as soon as he said that the president has retired for the evening, lights are out at Aspen, we could go home. And quite often, it was 8 o'clock. But later on, when all the turmoil created, Nixon was up late nights at Camp David. But at 8 o'clock at night, I could go home, and Nixon generally didn't wake up until 9:30 in the morning. But he had a lot of, I know when I left, I know he was up all hours of the night when he had a lot of stress and a lot of, and I might also mention that I could, just the way Nixon talked on the telephone, like early on before all the pressure of Vietnam and Watergate and the re-election, I mean, he was always so polite on the phone. We would say, yes, sir. He would say, operator, would you get me Mr. Haldeman, please? Thank you, Mr. President. Now, after all this stress later on, before I left, a typical thing would be, yes, sir. He said, Haldeman, please. Hang up. So you could tell the tension and the pressure was starting to mount on this president.
Well, just finally, when you were mentioning Mark several times. Now, Mark served with a different president.
Right, I was at White House Communications from 1982 to 1988 under Reagan.
Well, we'll try and get you back, probably early spring.
And Mark personally got to meet President Reagan, right?
A couple of different times.
And I never went face to face. Nixon was a totally different president than Reagan. Guys would leave WACA and they often would get a handshake from President Reagan. Nixon was not that type of individual.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. And we
Welcome,
wanted to
very
give you
welcome.
one of our challenge coins.
I appreciate that.
And please, come back and visit with Mark.
I still have a voice.
I was asked to make two quick announcements. One, there is a new exhibit which opens today at the Depot Museum, just up the hill from us, titled Broomfield Heights in the 1950s and 1960s, and it'll be open today. So if you haven't visited the Depot Museum, it's really a fascinating look into our Broomfield history. And they'll be open until 4 p.m. And please look at the memorabilia that Mike has in the back there. And I also have copies of our coffee and conversation schedule in case you'd like to pick one up. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you again, Mike.